The clock had just struck midnight at Metropolitan General Hospital. Dr. Amy Richardson stepped out of the operating room, finally removing her surgical cap after a grueling 12-hour emergency surgery. Her patient, a young mother of 3, would live to see her children grow up thanks to the delicate procedure she had performed to remove a life-threatening brain tumor. Exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders as she walked through the quiet hospital corridors. The night shift nurses smiled warmly at her. They all knew Dr. Richardson not just as one of the city's top neurosurgeons, but as someone who always took time to ask about their families and remember their birthdays. Tonight, though, she could barely keep her eyes open. All she wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and crawl into bed. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty when she reached her black SUV. The cool night air helped wake her up a bit as she settled into the driver's seat. She had made this drive hundreds of times before, 15 minutes down the highway, then through the quiet suburban streets to her house. Her thoughts drifted to the morning ahead. She had promised to video call her parents, both retired now and living in Florida. Her father, a former judge, always had valuable advice about navigating life's challenges as a black professional. The highway was peaceful at this hour, with only a few trucks keeping her company on the road. She had just turned onto the exit ramp when she noticed the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath, remembering her father's careful instructions from years ago. Stay calm, move slowly, keep your hands visible. She signaled and pulled over to the shoulder, making sure to stop under a street light. Her father's voice echoed in her mind as she went through the motions. Turn off the engine, interior lights on, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Even in her exhausted state, these movements were automatic, practiced. Through her side mirror, she watched the police officer approach. Something about his walk seemed off, too aggressive, too rushed. Her heart rate picked up slightly, but she maintained her composed demeanor. She was still wearing her hospital scrubs under her coat, her hospital ID badge clearly visible on her chest. The tap on her window was harder than necessary. Dr. Richardson pressed the button to lower it, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. Before she could even speak, the officer's flashlight beam hit her eyes with unnecessary intensity. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone sharp and hostile. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Good evening, officer," Dr. Richardson responded professionally, despite her growing unease. "I'm just heading home from the hospital. I've been in surgery all." "I said license and registration," he cut her off, his voice rising. "I don't need your life story." Dr. Richardson felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She'd been here before, though not recently, not since she'd moved to this supposedly progressive city 5 years ago. She could feel the officer's assumptions building with each passing second, watching her through a lens of preconceptions rather than seeing the accomplished physician she was. "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now." She narrated her movements, just as her father had taught her. The knot in her stomach tightened as she noticed the officer's hand shift to rest on his holster. As she reached slowly for her purse, her hospital ID badge caught the beam of the flashlight. Any reasonable officer would have noticed it, would have seen her surgical scrubs, would have connected the dots about why a medical professional might be on the road at this hour. But something told her this encounter was about to become much more complicated than a routine traffic stop. What happened next would change not just Dr. Richardson's life, but the entire city's approach to law enforcement. And it all started with that simple flash of red and blue lights on a quiet midnight drive home. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Bradley stepped closer to Dr. Richardson's window. His flashlight beam continued to blind her, moving erratically between her face and the car's interior. Despite her clear hospital ID and professional appearance, his aggressive stance never softened. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" His tone dripped with suspicion, completely ignoring her earlier attempt to explain she was coming from the hospital. "No, officer, I don't," Dr. Richardson replied steadily, though exhaustion made her voice slightly hoarse from the long surgery. "I was following the speed limit and—" "You were swerving," he interrupted, though she knew perfectly well she hadn't been. "Have you been drinking tonight?" The accusation hung in the air, absurd given her surgical scrubs and hospital ID. No, officer. As I mentioned, I'm coming directly from Metropolitan General Hospital, where I just finished performing emergency surgery. I'm a neurosurgeon there, and you can see my ID badge right. Step out of the vehicle, Officer Bradley demanded, cutting her off again. His hand remained firmly on his holster, his body language becoming increasingly aggressive. Dr. Richardson's heart raced, but her voice remained calm. Years of performing high-stakes surgery had taught her to maintain composure under pressure. Officer, I respectfully decline to exit my vehicle. I've identified myself as a medical professional, and I'm happy to provide my license and registration as requested. If there's a concern, I'd like to speak with a supervisor. This seemed to anger him further. I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Now, he moved his hand to the door handle, and Dr. Richardson felt a surge of fear mixed with determination. She knew her rights, just as she knew this situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. A few cars drove past slowly, their headlights illuminating the scene. Dr. Richardson noticed at least 2 vehicles pulling over a safe distance away, their occupants likely recording the interaction on their phones. She felt simultaneously grateful for the witnesses and terrified about why she needed them. "Officer," she tried one more time, her voice clear and professional, "I am Dr. Emmy Richardson, head of neurosurgery at Metropolitan General. I've just completed a 12-hour emergency surgery and am heading home. I'm happy to comply with reasonable requests, but I'm also concerned about your approach to this situation. Could we please wait for your supervisor?" Instead of responding to her rational request, Officer Bradley's face contorted with anger. "You people always think you're special, don't you? Always with the excuses and attitudes. Get out of the car now, or I'll remove you myself." Dr. Richardson's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them visible on the steering wheel. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she had held these same hands steady during a delicate brain surgery, saving a life. Now they shook as she faced an officer who refused to seat her as the professional she was. She thought about her father's advice. "Sometimes, baby, you have to stand your ground. But you also have to live to fight another day." In that moment, she had to make a choice between her dignity and her safety. As a surgeon, she knew all too well how quickly situations could turn tragic. More patrol cars were approaching in the distance, their lights painting the night in swirling red and blue. Dr. Richardson hoped that among them would be a more reasonable officer, someone who would see the situation for what it was. But before backup could arrive, Officer Bradley had already made his next move. The sound of her car door being yanked open shattered the night air. Dr. Richardson's seatbelt was still fastened, but that didn't stop the officer from reaching for her arm. The same hands that had carefully navigated human brain tissue hours earlier were now being roughly grabbed by someone who had sworn to protect and serve. What happened in the next few moments would not only change the course of Dr. Richardson's life, but would also spark a conversation that would ripple through the entire city's police force. As backup approached and more witnesses gathered, no one realized they were about to witness an incident that would force their community to confront some uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the long road to real change. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Bradley yanked Dr. Richardson's car door open. The same hands that had delicately saved a life just hours ago now gripped her steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white with tension. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, but her voice remained steady as she spoke. "Officer, I'm still wearing my seatbelt. Please stop pulling my arm. You're hurting me." Her medical training kicked in as she mentally noted the growing pain in her shoulder, possible strain to the rotator cuff, she thought automatically. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones raised, their camera lights adding to the surreal scene. A young woman's voice carried clearly through the night air. "This isn't right. She's clearly a doctor." Others joined in, their concerned murmurs growing louder. "Exit the vehicle now." Officer Bradley shouted, his face red with anger. "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," Dr. Richardson replied calmly, though her heart raced. "I'm trying to safely unbuckle my seatbelt, which is difficult while you're pulling my arm. Please allow me to move carefully." More patrol cars arrived, their lights casting strange shadows across the scene. Dr. Richardson could see other officers approaching, but Officer Bradley wasn't backing down. With one hand still gripping her arm, he reached across her to release the seatbelt himself. "I can do that myself," she protested, maintaining her professional tone despite the humiliation of the situation. "Please step back and allow me to comply with your request safely." The seatbelt clicked free, and Officer Bradley immediately tried to pull her from the vehicle. Dr. Richardson's medical instincts took over. She knew sudden movements could cause injury. She tried to guide her own exit from the car, attempting to maintain some control over her body's movement. "Stop fighting," Officer Bradley yelled, though she was doing nothing of the sort. The crowd's voices grew louder, more concerned. Someone shouted that they were calling the hospital to verify her identity. As she finally stood outside her car, Dr. Richardson kept her movements slow and deliberate. Her surgical scrubs caught the light of dozens of phones recording the incident. The hospital ID badge still hung around her neck, swaying slightly in the cool night breeze. "Officer," she said clearly, knowing the importance of documentation, "I am Dr. Annie Richardson, head of neurosurgery at Metropolitan General Hospital. I have just completed a 12-hour emergency surgery. I am unarmed and have been compliant. I am now requesting immediate medical attention for my shoulder, which was injured during this interaction. I am also formally requesting your supervisor's presence." Her clinical tone seemed to throw Officer Bradley off balance momentarily. Other officers were now close enough to hear her clearly stated credentials. She noticed some of them exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, their phones still recording. Dr. Richardson recognized a nurse from her hospital among them, someone who had assisted her in surgery just that morning. The nurse was frantically making phone calls, likely reaching out to hospital administration. "Place your hands behind your back," Officer Bradley demanded, reaching for his handcuffs. "Officer," another voice called out, one of the newly arrived officers, "maybe we should wait a minute here. She's saying she's a doctor." But Officer Bradley wasn't listening. He moved to grab Dr. Richardson's arms, seemingly oblivious to the growing number of witnesses and fellow officers expressing concern. The pain in her shoulder intensified, and she couldn't help but wince. "Please," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air, "I have surgery scheduled tomorrow morning. There's a patient, a 10-year-old boy, waiting for a life-saving procedure. I need my hands to save lives. Please don't do this." The mention of her young patient seemed to catch the attention of several onlookers and officers. Someone in the crowd mentioned knowing the family of the boy scheduled for surgery. The ripple of recognition spread through the gathered witnesses. What happened next would prove to be the turning point, not just for this confrontation, but for the entire police department's approach to community relations. As more patrol cars arrived and the crowd of witnesses grew, no one realized they were about to witness a moment that would force their city to confront its deepest biases and spark a movement for genuine change. Just as Officer Bradley reached for his handcuffs, a police SUV screeched to a halt nearby. Lieutenant Wong jumped out, her eyes quickly scanning the scene before her. She froze for a split second, recognition dawning on her face. "Dr. Richardson," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. "Oh my God, stop everything right now." Officer Bradley hesitated, his hands still on the handcuffs. "Lieutenant, this suspect." "Suspect?" Lieutenant Wong interrupted, rushing forward. "This is Dr. Annie Richardson, the surgeon who saved my mother's life 3 months ago." Officer Bradley stepped back immediately. The crowd murmured as Lieutenant Wong approached. Many remembered the news story from a few months back. A beloved police lieutenant's mother had suffered a devastating stroke, and a brilliant neurosurgeon had performed a miraculous surgery that saved her life. "Dr. Richardson," Lieutenant Wong said, her voice filled with concern, "are you all right? What happened to your shoulder?" "I'm experiencing some pain from being forcefully removed from my vehicle," Dr. Richardson replied professionally, though exhaustion and stress were evident in her voice. "I was trying to explain that I'm coming from a lengthy emergency surgery at Metropolitan General." Lieutenant Wong turned to Officer Bradley, her expression hard. "Did you not see her hospital ID? The surgical scrubs? Did you even ask where she was coming from?" The growing crowd of onlookers had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold. Among them, a man stepped forward, his phone still recording. "I have the whole thing on video, Lieutenant." He wouldn't let her explain anything. More voices joined in from the crowd. She kept trying to tell him she was a doctor. He wouldn't listen. We all saw it. Officer Bradley's face had lost its aggressive expression, replaced by something between confusion and dawning horror. Lieutenant Wong was already on her radio, calling for medical assistance for Dr. Richardson's shoulder. My mother couldn't move her left side at all after her stroke, Lieutenant Wong announced loudly, making sure everyone present could hear. The other hospitals said there was nothing they could do. But Dr. Richardson spent 8 hours in surgery and saved her life. Now my mum plays with her grandkids again. She turned to Officer Bradley. This woman has saved more lives in this city than you can imagine. Last month, she performed emergency surgery on Officer Martinez's son after his accident. The month before that, she helped Chief Thompson's wife when she had a brain tumor. The other officers on scene began to shift uncomfortably, several of them now recognizing Dr. Richardson. One young officer spoke up. "Wait, Dr. Richardson. She saved my uncle last year. That complicated brain surgery no one else would attempt." Dr. Richardson maintained her professional demeanor despite the pain in her shoulder. "Lieutenant Wong, I appreciate your intervention, but I need to point out that my credentials shouldn't be necessary for basic respect and dignity. Every person deserves to be treated fairly by law enforcement, regardless of their profession or status in the community." The lieutenant nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Doctor. And we're going to address that. But first, let's get your shoulder checked out. I believe an ambulance is arriving now." As paramedics approached, more stories began emerging from the crowd. A teacher mentioned how Dr. Richardson had saved her student's life after a bus accident. A restaurant owner recognized her as the surgeon who operated on his wife. Each story added to the growing realization of just how many lives this doctor had touched. Officer Bradley stood frozen, the handcuffs now hanging limply at his side. The reality of his actions was sinking in. He hadn't just wrongfully attacked any citizen, he'd assaulted someone who had saved countless lives in their community, including those of his fellow officers' family members. An older officer nearby shook his head. The emergency room at Metropolitan General Hospital buzzed with unusual energy that night. Word had spread quickly through the hospital staff. Their beloved neurosurgeon, Dr. Richardson, was now a patient in her own hospital. The same nurses who had assisted her in surgery just hours earlier now hovered nearby, their faces tight with concern. "The X-rays show no fractures," explained Dr. Lee, the ER physician, as she examined Dr. Richardson's shoulder. "But there's significant soft tissue injury. You'll need physical therapy, and I'm recommending at least a week off from surgery." Dr. Richardson shook her head immediately. "I have a 10-year-old boy scheduled for tomorrow morning. His tumor won't wait a week." Lieutenant Wong, who had insisted on accompanying Dr. Richardson to the hospital, stepped forward. "Doctor, I understand your dedication, but your health has to come first." Just then, the hospital's chief of medicine walked in, still wearing his pajamas under his white coat. He'd rushed in from home after hearing the news. "Emmy, I've already called Dr. Chen from County. He can handle tomorrow's surgery. You need to rest and heal." The events at the traffic stop had triggered a chain reaction throughout the city's medical and law enforcement communities. In the hospital waiting room, officers from 3 different precincts had gathered, many of them family members of patients Dr. Richardson had treated. They shared stories, their voices heavy with shame about what their colleague had done. "She operated on my daughter last year," one detective told the group. 16 hours straight, wouldn't leave until she knew everything was perfect, and this is how we repay her. Back in the examination room, Dr. Richardson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages of support. The video of the incident had already gone viral, spreading through police and medical community group chats. The mayor's office had called twice. Officer Bradley sat alone in his patrol car, parked at the station, staring at his steering wheel. His supervisor had just finished a lengthy discussion with him, words like administrative leave and internal investigation still ringing in his ears. But what haunted him most was learning that his own aunt was scheduled for surgery with Dr. Richardson next month, a surgery that might now be delayed because of his actions. Meanwhile, the young mother whose life Dr. Richardson had saved earlier that day was recovering in the ICU, completely unaware of what had happened to her surgeon. Her family, however, had seen the viral video. They stood outside her room, discussing in hushed, angry whispers how the doctor who had just saved their loved one had been treated. "I need to check on my patient from earlier," Dr. Richardson insisted, trying to stand up despite the pain in her shoulder. The nurses exchanged knowing looks. This was typical of their dedicated surgeon, always putting patients first. Lieutenant Wong watched as hospital staff rallied around Dr. Richardson. A physical therapist had already arrived to demonstrate exercises. An orthopedic specialist was reviewing the x-rays. The hospital's legal team had gathered in a nearby conference room. "Dr. Richardson," the lieutenant said softly, "I know this isn't the right time, but I need to ask, would you be willing to help us make real changes in the department? We need someone like you, someone who can speak to both the medical and law enforcement communities." Before Dr. Richardson could answer, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the mother of the 10-year-old boy scheduled for tomorrow's surgery. She had seen the video and was beside herself with worry, not for her son's surgery, but for the doctor who was supposed to perform it. The night shift nurses brought Dr. Richardson some tea, the same kind she always drank during her long surgery days. One of them had tears in her eyes as she spoke. "We see you save lives every day, doctor. Black lives, white lives, police officers' lives, everyone. How could anyone look at you and see anything but a hero?" Dr. Richardson took a sip of her tea, wincing slightly as she moved her shoulder. The events of the night swirled in her mind, from saving a life in the operating room to having her own life threatened during a simple traffic stop. The irony wasn't lost on her. As dawn approached, the hospital corridor outside her room had become an impromptu gathering place. Police officers, hospital staff, and community members mingled, sharing stories about Dr. Richardson's impact on their lives. What had started as a terrible incident was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of reckoning, a chance for change, and perhaps most importantly, a revelation of how one person's dedication to helping others could bridge even the deepest divides in a community. The police department's internal affairs office had never seen so much activity on a Monday morning. By 9 a.m., 5 different videos of the incident had been submitted, each showing Dr. Richardson's encounter with Officer Bradley from different angles. The clearest one came from a nursing student who had recognized Dr. Richardson immediately. Her hands were steady as she filmed, just as they would need to be in surgery. "Play that part again," Captain Reynolds instructed, leaning forward in his chair. The room fell silent as they watched Dr. Richardson, calmly stating her credentials, while Officer Bradley escalated the situation. The captain shook his head, his face grim. He didn't even let her finish a single sentence. Down the hall, Officer Bradley sat with his union representative, watching his own body camera footage. His face grew paler with each passing minute. The camera had captured everything: his aggressive tone, his refusal to listen, the way he ignored her visible hospital ID and professional attire. But worst of all, it captured the moment Lieutenant Wong arrived and revealed exactly who he had been manhandling. "In my 20 years on the force," his union rep said quietly, "I've never seen such a clear-cut case of misconduct. You need to start thinking about resignation before this goes further." Meanwhile, at Metropolitan General Hospital, administrators were reviewing their own security footage. Dr. Richardson could be seen leaving the operating room at midnight after her emergency surgery, still wearing the same scrubs she'd been arrested in. The timestamp matched perfectly with her story. The hospital's chief of medicine stood before the board of directors, his voice steady but angry. "One of our most talented surgeons was assaulted while wearing her hospital ID and surgical scrubs. She had just saved a life, and then had her own life put at risk. This cannot stand." Back at the police station, testimonials were pouring in. A school principal wrote about how Dr. Richardson had performed free surgeries for 2 students whose families couldn't afford care. A retired police officer sent a letter describing how she had spent hours explaining his wife's procedure to them, drawing diagrams until they understood everything. "Look at this," Lieutenant Wong said, spreading papers across the conference table. "Hospital records show she's performed over 1,000 surgeries in our city. Success rate above 98%. Multiple innovations in surgical techniques. She's literally written the book on certain procedures." The investigation team worked through security footage from the hospital parking lot, traffic cameras, and Dr. Richardson's car's dash cam. Each new angle only confirmed what they already knew. There had been no swerving, no suspicious behavior, nothing to justify the stop in the first place. "We've got the 911 calls too," an investigator announced, pressing play on the audio system. The room filled with concerned voices of witnesses. "There's an officer attacking a doctor. She's wearing scrubs and has her hospital ID. Someone needs to help her. She keeps saying she's a surgeon." In the police chief's office, community leaders had gathered for an emergency meeting. The president of the local medical association spoke first. "This isn't just about Dr. Richardson. This is about every medical professional working late hours to save lives. They need to know they can drive home safely after helping our community." The investigation revealed more uncomfortable truths. Records showed Officer Bradley had a history of complaints about aggressive behavior, particularly during traffic stops. Each complaint had been handled separately, missing the pattern that now seems so obvious when viewed together. Dr. Richardson's shoulder injury meant she had to postpone 3 critical surgeries. The investigation team added these delays to their report, along with statements from the waiting patients' families. One mother wrote, "The officer who hurt Dr. Richardson didn't just attack her. He attacked every person waiting for her help." As the day progressed, more officers came forward with personal stories about Dr. Richardson. An officer's wife spoke about how the doctor had held her hand through her entire consultation, explaining everything in simple terms. Another described how she had stayed late to call his family after his surgery, making sure they understood his recovery plan. The evidence was overwhelming, but it wasn't just about building a case against one officer. Each new revelation added to a larger picture of systemic issues that needed addressing. How had Officer Bradley's previous complaints been overlooked? Why weren't medical IDs and professional credentials being respected? What needed to change in training and supervision? By evening, the investigation had expanded beyond just that night's incident. It had become a catalyst for examining deeper issues in police training, bias recognition, and community relations. As the sun set over the city, the investigation team was no longer just looking at what went wrong that night. They were looking at how to make sure it never happened again to anyone, regardless of their profession or position in society. 3 months after the incident, Dr. Richardson stood at a podium in the police academy's main hall. Her shoulder had healed, thanks to excellent physical therapy, and she was back to performing surgeries. But today, she wasn't wearing surgical scrubs. She was dressed professionally to address the newest class of police recruits. "I didn't want to be here today," she began honestly, looking out at the sea of faces. "When Lieutenant Wong first asked me to help with police training reform, I wanted to focus on healing and return to my normal life. But then I realized maybe this was a chance to heal something bigger than just my shoulder." The audience sat in complete silence. Among them was Officer Bradley, no longer in uniform. After resigning from the force, he had asked to attend these training sessions as a civilian. He sat in the back row, his face showing the weight of his actions and their consequences. "Last week, I performed brain surgery on a young police officer's daughter," Dr. Richardson continued. "Her father sat in the waiting room wearing his uniform, probably worried sick about his little girl. When I walked in to tell him the surgery was successful, there was no fear in his eyes, only trust and gratitude. That's the relationship we need between law enforcement and every member of our community." The changes in the department had been swift and significant. Every officer now underwent enhanced bias recognition training. Traffic stop procedures had been completely revamped. Hospital IDs and medical personnel were given special recognition in police training. But the impact went beyond just policy changes. The incident had sparked genuine dialogue between law enforcement and the medical community. Regular meetings between hospital staff and police officers helped both groups understand each other's challenges and stress. "Yesterday," Dr. Richardson shared, "I had a traffic stop on my way home from surgery. The officer approached respectfully, explained why she had pulled me over, and listened when I identified myself. We had a normal, professional interaction. That's all anyone asks for, to be seen and heard as a human being." In the months since the incident, Dr. Richardson had performed dozens more successful surgeries, including several on police officers and their family members. Each operation became a bridge between communities, a reminder that beneath any uniform, whether police blues or surgical scrubs, we're all human. The police chief stepped forward to join Dr. Richardson at the podium. Thanks to Dr. Richardson's willingness to work with us, we've completely transformed our training program. But more importantly, we've transformed our mindset. Every person we interact with could be someone who saves lives, teaches children, or serves our community in countless other ways. In the audience, Lieutenant Wong watched with pride. The changes she had helped implement were showing real results. Civilian complaints had dropped significantly, and community trust was slowly being rebuilt. The local news had followed up on the story, interviewing people whose lives Dr. Richardson had saved both before and after the incident. One particularly moving segment featured the 10-year-old boy whose surgery had been delayed by her injury, now fully recovered and playing basketball with his friends. "I could have responded to that night with anger," Dr. Richardson told the recruits. "Instead, I chose to help create change. Every one of you has that same choice in every interaction you have with the public. Your badge gives you power, but how you use that power defines who you are." As she concluded her speech, Dr. Richardson noticed several people wiping tears from their eyes. Even the most hardened veterans in the room seemed moved. She had shown them that real strength isn't in aggressive authority, but in the wisdom to use power responsibly. The training program she helped develop was already being adopted by other police departments across the state. What had started as a traumatic traffic stop had evolved into a movement for positive change. "Tomorrow morning," she said in closing, "I'll be back in surgery, doing my part to save lives. Tonight, you'll be out on patrol, doing your part to protect lives. We're all in this together. Let's make sure everyone gets home safely to continue their important work." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her words, it was for the promise of change they represented. As Dr. Richardson left the podium, she knew that while she couldn't heal every wound in society, she had helped start a process of healing that would continue long after that night's events had faded from memory.